For a great many, Japanese fashion in both its design and application is awe-inspiring. It's similar to what you'd expect out west, but distinctly different. What's up, everybody? It's your boy Reggie Casual, and today we break down Japanese fashion in its entirety as briefly as we can so you can have better insight into the methodology and cultural cues that make it special and worth studying. That's the intro. Let's get it. Japanese fashion in its entirety can be summed up into three words: cultural, interpretive, and innovative. There's obviously more words we could use, but these words in particular have a certain weight to them when speaking about something as grand as Japanese fashion. From a cultural standpoint, Japanese fashion is obvious. Most of us can point to traditional garb like kimono, yukata, hakama, jinbei, and noragi as clear examples of unequivocal Japanese fashion. But these traditional clothings have had a markedly profound effect on modern fashion, from textile choice to cut, shape, and silhouettes of modern designs and styles. This distinct cultural identity through the traditional has led to Japanese fashion's distinction and further has influenced designers the world over. Since the 1850s, Japanese traditional fashion and techniques have been a great inspiration to Western design houses. In fact, it could be said that well before Japan was interpreting Western fashion, it was the West feverishly interpreting the Orient via Japanese traditional methodology. But that's a story for another time, I suppose. This brings us well into interpretation, and this is where Japanese fashion comes at its most dense, at least the information. We could be here for days discussing it, but as far as a Cliff Notes version, let's look at how specific Japanese designers took Western ideals and identity, learned how to imitate it, and then through a little imagination, made it their own. Of course, first, we have to bring up Rei Kawakubo. After initially working as an advertising stylist, she took her influences ranging from punk to her own brand of feminism to her eventual label, Comme des Garçons, adding a distinct masculinity to the female form. At the time, in both Japan and even Europe, it was seen as unsightly upon its arrival, only to years later be celebrated as a forerunner of the avant-garde. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Hiroshi Fujiwara, who took modern Western street styles and interpreted them in a way for Japanese to partake. What he understood, above all else, is that the Japanese could never manifest the culture of street that he came to observe in neighborhoods of London and New York. So instead, he brought back what could be interpreted, cultural reference points for study, and the clothing itself so it could be reimagined for a Japanese audience. His contributions led to the advent of street fashion in Japan and its golden age in the 90s, and led to the breakneck careers of Hiroki Nakamura of Visvum, Shinsuke Takizawa of Neighborhood, and of course Nigo, formerly Babe, and now Human Made. There are several more designers that we can pull from, Yohji Yamamoto, Kenzo Takada, Issey Miyake, Kansai Yamamoto notwithstanding, but again, it's a large list that defines the character of Japanese fashion. However, a short blurb should go to the author, not somebody in fashion, Shintaro Ishihara, who wrote the novels Taiyo no Kisetsu, Season of the Sun, and Crazed Fruit, both which became adapted for films. And a line can be drawn directly from these 1950 films into the Japanese embracing the Japanification of things that they've adopted from the West. For instance, many point to the classic Rebel Without a Cause that spurred on this movement of Western American interest for the Japanese. People wanted to imitate James Dean. But it wasn't until Crazed Fruit and Taiyo no Kisetsu, Season of the Sun, that the Japanese could see what their version of that Rebel Without a Cause looked at. The stories were distinctly Japanese, exposing a tireless youth doing everything it could to abandon the ideas of conservative traditionalism, leading to what we now know as the Taiyozoku, or Sun Tribe, which is quite extreme politically, I might add. That guy Ishihara, who wrote the novels, ended up becoming governor of Tokyo and was incredibly hawkish, blaming foreigners, specifically Koreans, for upticks in crime, and saying Roppongi is filled with Africans, not African Americans, who can't speak English, and if we're gonna let people in, they have to be intelligent. So don't give this guy his flowers, but not mentioning him and his influence in fashion interpretation is just intellectually dishonest. Tangents aside, because we can go into an entire background on Ishihara, which we'll probably do later, Interpretation, specifically cultural interpretation, is a major part of Japanese fashion. In order to truly understand Japanese fashion conceptually, one must abandon the idea of Japanese simply imitating Western fashion and instead with them reinventing it in a Japanese way. Finally, we come to innovation. Japan has always been a land of innovation. They're specifically adept at horizontal innovation, which is simply the transfer of knowledge and technology from one sector to another. In fashion, this innovation is obvious in a few ways, but for the sake of being thorough. The construction techniques of kimono applied to Western apparel is one such horizontal innovative thing that the Japanese have applied, or even the silhouettes of Japanese traditional fashion to be applied to Western apparel. And also the development of fabrics like Solotech and their application into contemporary fashion. Even the Japanese penchant for deconstruction and using modern tailoring to reinvent the contemporary, like the design seen in the work of Chitose Abe, Junichi Abe, Miharu Yasuhiro, and Junya Watanabe. The wild street fashions on display in areas like Harajuku and Daikanyama, for example, while a far cry from its heavy, innovative heyday, still scream of the Japanese of things, despite how familiar it is to Western eyes. And that's just a sample of horizontal innovation in Japanese fashion. For in Japan, it's not that things are wildly different, particularly today. It's that it's undeniably consistent. The sheer amount of Japanese that partake in fashion is innumerable, and the aptitude is quite high. So in order to understand Japanese fashion, you must not just stop at fashion per se, you have to understand Japanese culture. It is the single most important element that defines it past the Western influences. Japan, nor Asia in its entirety, isn't the West. Therefore, it becomes irresponsible to equate, or worse, impose upon them the same general rules, ideas, and principles present in the West. Because fashion is largely lifestyle-based in Japan, so the ideas diverge wildly on how you represent yourself. Which is odd considering Japan's homogenous nature, but also predictable due to fashion not being as politically charged in Japan compared to, like, say, America. That is, Japanese fashion isn't as inhibited by issues of cultural appropriation, which has allowed for far more risk without social pushback. While some takes could be considered questionable to a Western eye, the lack of Western judgment has left Japanese fashion largely unimpeded, and the results often speak for themselves. Chances are taken, which has allowed for a fashion culture that is colorful and dynamic, less trend-driven by social influence and noticeably slower than its Western counterparts. However, Japanese fashion isn't palatable for everyone. Some see the styles presented as overly costumey and far too quirky for daily life. Many also believe Japan to be weird like that, and its fashion simply has very little place in Western society. The advent of Korean styles, made popular by groups like BTS and Blackpink, which take far heavier direct influences from trendy Western fashion without the cultural baggage, have noticeably become more palatable for a new age of young fashion enthusiasts. This leaves Japan in a bit of a bind as the industry capitalizes on the popularity of celebrity fashion, which Japan has not often relied on. What we can take from this is that Japan is losing its footing internationally, becoming far more for archivists and individuals particularly enamored with Japanese design, brands, and methodology. However, because Japanese brands do not operate in the same fashion as the West, less individuals are able to partake in labels that have gained cultural value via social influence, like in the case of brands like Capital. I'm reminded of an individual who told me the reason why Japanese shops rarely showcase or are allowed to be filmed indoors. One, because it will annoy other customers, but two, because exclusivity and protecting that exclusivity is paramount. Japanese brands don't want you to simply wear. They want you to understand what you are wearing. And that's an easy prospect for the Japanese. They naturally do this. For everyone else, you'll have to learn it. And that's why, hopefully, you're here. With that said, that's how you could at least start to understand Japanese fashion. But seeing as how I've studied it for a while, my hope is that you stay here to learn a little bit more with me. So, question. What are some things about Japanese fashion that you'd like to know, and what inspirations would you like more insight into? Or any opinion will suffice, just let it all be known in the comments. And if you want to learn how this all works in the fashion business and industry and how to build your very own thoughtful brand, join us on Patreon to get access to our monthly fashion business webinar and private Discord. But most importantly, keep it locked right here for all of your info in international fashion, culture, and business from Tokyo. It's your boy, and keep it casual. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. and I'll see you guys in a minute.